and flowers. 13th at the baths, merchants, trophies of war, the banquet, Trias, the ball, North, Koyame, the border, the Huico tanks, massacre of the Tiguas, Carrizal, a desert spring, the Medanos, an inquest concerning teeth, Nakori, the cantina, a desperate encounter, into the mountains, a village decimated, mounted lancers, a skirmish, pursuing the survivors, the plains of Chihuahua, slaughter of the soldiers, a burial, Chihuahua, westward. Their progress was swelled by new riders, by boys on muleback and old men in plaited hats, and a deputation that took charge of the captured horses and mules, and hazed them on through the narrow streets toward the bullring where they could be kept. The tattered campaigners surged on, some now holding aloft cups that had been pressed upon them, waving to the ladies clustered on the balconies their putrescent hats, and elevating the bobbing heads with those strange half-lidded looks of ennui into which the features had dried, all so hemmed about now by the citizenry that they seemed the vanguard of some ragged uprising, and heralded before by a pair of drummers, one witless, and both barefoot, and by a trumpeter who marched with one arm raised above his head, in a martial gesture, and playing the while. In this manner they passed through the standing portals of the governor's palace, over the worn stone sills, and into the courtyard where the broomed hooves of the mercenaries' shoeless horses subsided upon the cobbles with a curious turtle-like clatter. Hundreds of onlookers pressed about as the dried scalps were counted out upon the stones. Soldiers with muskets kept back the crowds, and young girls watched the Americans with huge black eyes, and boys crept forth to touch the grisly trophies. There were 128 scalps and 8 heads, and the governor's lieutenant and his retinue came down into the courtyard to welcome them and admire their work. They were promised full payment in gold at the dinner to be held in their honor that evening at the Riddle and Stevens Hotel, and with this the Americans sent up a cheer and mounted their horses again. Old women in black rebozos ran forth to kiss the hems of their reeking shirts and hold up their dark little hands in blessing, and the riders wheeled their gaunted mounts and pushed through the clamoring multitude and into the street. They moved on to the public baths, where they descended one by one into the waters, each more pale than the one before, and all tattooed, branded, sutured, the great puckered scars inaugurated God knows where by what barbarous surgeons across chests and abdomens like the tracks of gigantic millipedes. Some deformed, fingers missing, eyes, their foreheads, and arms stamped with letters and numbers, as if they were articles requiring inventory. Citizens of both sexes withdrew along the walls and watched the water turn into a thin gruel of blood and filth, and none could take their eyes from the judge who had disrobed last of all, and now walked the perimeter of the baths with a cigar in his mouth and a regal air, testing the waters with one toe surprisingly petite. He shone like the moon, so pale he was, and not a hair to be seen anywhere upon that vast corpus, not in any crevice, nor in the great bores of his nose, and not upon his chest, nor in his ears, nor any tuft at all above his eyes, nor to the lids thereof. The immense and gleaming dome of his naked skull looked like a cap for bathing, pulled down to the otherwise darkened skin of his face and neck. As that great bulk lowered itself into the bath, the waters rose perceptibly, and when he had submerged himself to the eyes, he looked about with considerable pleasure, the eyes slightly crinkled, as if he were smiling under the water like some pale and bloated manatee surfaced in a bog, while behind his small and close-set ear, the wedged cigar smoked gently just above the waterline. By now, merchants had spread their wares all along the clay tiles behind them, suits of European cloth, and cut and shirts of colored silks, and close-napped beaver hats and fine Spanish leather boots, silver-headed canes and riding crops and silver-mounted saddles and carven pipes and hideout guns and a group of Toledo swords with ivory hilts and nicely chased blades, and barbers were setting up chairs to receive them, crying out the names of celebrated patrons upon whom they had attended, and all of these entrepreneurs assuring the company of credit on the most generous terms. When they crossed the square attired in their new haberdashery, some with coat sleeves barely past their elbows, the scalps were being strung about the iron fretwork of the gazebo like decorations for some barbaric celebration. The severed heads had been raised on poles above the lampstandards, where they now contemplated with their caved and pagan eyes the dry hides of their kinsmen and forebears strung across the stone facade of the cathedral and clacking lightly in the wind. Later, when the lamps were lit, the heads in the soft glare of the uplight assumed the look of tragic masks, and within a few days they would become mottled white and altogether leprous with the droppings of the birds that roosted upon them. This angel Trias, who was governor, had been sent abroad as a young man for his education and was widely read in the classics and was a student of languages. He was also a man among men, and the rough warriors he'd hired for the protection of the state seemed to warm something in him. When the lieutenant invited Glanton and his officers to dine, Glanton replied that he and his men did not keep separate mess. The lieutenant yielded the point with a smile, and Trias had done the same. They arrived in good order, shaved and shorn, and turned out in their new boots and finery, the Delawares strangely austere and menacing in their morning coats, all to gather about the table set for them. Cigars were presented, and glasses of sherry poured, and the governor standing at the head of the table made them welcome, and issued orders to his chamberlain that every need be seen to. Soldiers attended them, fetching extra glasses, pouring the wine, lighting cigars from a wick in a silver holder designed for just that purpose. The judge arrived last of all, dressed in a well-cut suit of unbleached linen that had been made for him that very afternoon. Whole bolts of cloth exhausted and squads of tailors as well in that fabrication. His feet were encased in nicely polished gray kid boots, and in his hand he held a Panama hat that had been spliced together from two such lesser hats by such painstaking work that the joinery did scarcely show at all. Trias had already taken his seat when the judge made his appearance, but no sooner had the governor seen him than he rose again, and they shook hands cordially, and the governor had him seated at his right, and they at once fell into conversation in a tongue. None other in that room spoke at all, saving for random vile epithets drifted down from the north. The ex-priest was sat opposite the kid, and he raised his brows and motioned toward the head of the table with a swing of his eyes. The kid, in the first starched collar he'd ever owned and the first cravat, sat mute as a tailor's dummy at that board. By now the table was fully commenced, and there was a tandem run of dishes, fish and fowl and beef and wild meats of the countryside, and a roast showed on a platter, and casseroles of savories and trifles and glaces and bottles of wine and brandy from the vineyards at El Paso. Patriotic toasts were drunk, the governor's aides raising their glasses to Washington and Franklin, and the Americans responding with yet more of their own country's heroes, ignorant alike of diplomacy and any name at all from the pantheon of their sister republic. They fell to, and they continued to eat until they had exhausted first the banquet, and then the larder of the hotel altogether. Couriers were sent abroad through the city to fetch more, only to have this also vanish, and more sent for, until Riddle's cook barricaded the door with his body, and the soldiers in attendance took to simply dumping great trays of pastries, fried meat skins, rounds of cheese, whatever they could find, out upon the table. The governor had tapped his glass and risen to speak in his well-phrased English, but the bloated and belching mercenaries were leering about and were calling for more drink, and some had not ceased to scream out toasts, now degenerated into obscene pledges to the whores of various southern cities. The bursar was introduced to cheers, catcalls, hoisted bumpers. Glanton took charge of the long canvas bag stamped with the state cartouche, and cutting the governor short, he rose and dumped the gold out onto the table among the bones and rinds and pools of spilled drink, and in a brisk drumhead disbursement divided out the pile of gold with the blade of his knife, so that each man was paid his spoken share and no further ceremony to it. A sort of skiffle band had struck up a lugubrious air in one corner of the hall, and first up was the judge, who ushered the players and their instruments into the adjoining ballroom, where a number of ladies who had been sent for sat already about the walls on benches and fanned themselves without apparent alarm. The Americans debouched into the dancing hall by ones and twos and by groups, chairs pushed back, chairs pushed over to lie where they fell. Wall lamps and their tin reflectors had been lit all about the room, and the celebrants foregathered there cast conflicting shadows. The scalp hunters stood grinning at the dames, churlish-looking in their shrunken clothes, sucking their teeth, armed with knives and pistols and mad about the eyes, The judge was in close conference with the band, and soon a quadrille was struck up. A great lurching and stomping ensued while the judge, affable, gallant, squired first one and then another of the ladies through the steps with an easy niceness. By midnight the governor had excused himself, and members of the band had begun to slip away. A blind street harpist stood terrified upon the banquet table among the bones and platters, and a horde of lurid-looking whores had infiltrated the dance. Pistol fire soon became general, and Mr. Riddle, who was acting American consul in the city, descended to remonstrate with the revelers and was warned away. Fights broke out. Furniture was disassembled, men waving chair legs, candle stands. 2 whores grappled and pitched into a sideboard and went to the floor in a crash of brandy glasses. Jackson, pistols drawn, lurched into the street vowing to shoot the ass off Jesus Christ, the long-legged white son of a bitch. At dawn, the shapes of insensate toppers lay snoring about the floor among dark patches of drying blood. Bathcat and the harpist lay asleep upon the banquet table in one another's arms. A family of thieves were tiptoeing through the wreckage, turning out the pockets of the sleepers, and the remains of a bonfire that had consumed a good part of the hotel's furnishings smoldered in the street before the door. These scenes and scenes like them were repeated night after night. The citizenry made address to the governor, but he was much like the sorcerer's apprentice, who could indeed provoke the imp to do his will, but could in no way make him cease again. The baths had become bordellos, the attendants driven off. The white stone fountain in the plaza was filled at night with naked and drunken men. Cantinas were evacuated as if by fire with the appearance of any 2 of the company, and the Americans found themselves in ghost taverns, with drinks on the tables and cigars still burning in the clay ashtrays. Horses were ridden indoors and out, and as the gold began to dwindle away, shopkeepers found themselves presented with debits scrawled on butcher paper in a foreign language for whole shelves of goods. Stores began to close. Charcoal scrawls appeared on the lime-washed walls. Mejor los indios. The evening streets stood empty and there were no paseos, and the young girls of the city were boarded up and seen no more. On the 15th of August they rode out. A week later, a company of drovers reported them investing the town of Koyame 80 miles to the northeast. The village of Koyame had for some years been laid under annual contribution by Gomez and his band. When Glanton and his men rode in, they were fallen upon as saints. Women ran alongside the horses to touch their boots, and presents of every kind were pressed upon them, until each man rode with an embarrassment of melons and pastries and trussed chickens gathered in the bow of his saddle. When they rode out 3 days later, the streets stood empty. Not even a dog followed them to the gates. They traveled northeast as far as the town of Presidio on the Texas border, and they crossed the horses and rode dripping through the streets, a soil where Glanton was subject to arrest. He rode out alone on the desert and sat the horse, and he and the horse and the dog looked out across the rolling scrubland and the barren peppercorn hills and the mountains and the flat brush country, and running plain beyond where 400 miles to the east were the wife and child that he would not see again. His shadow grew long before him on the banded wash of sand. He would not follow. He had taken off his hat for the evening wind to cool him, and at length he put it on again and turned the horse and rode back. They wandered the borderland for weeks seeking some sign of the Apache. Deployed upon that plain, they moved in a constant elision, ordained agents of the actual dividing out the world which they encountered and leaving what had been and what would never be alike extinguished on the ground behind them. Spectre horsemen, pale with dust, anonymous in the crenellated heat. Above all else they appeared wholly adventure, primal, provisional, devoid of order, like beings provoked out of the absolute rock, and set nameless and at no remove from their own loomings to wander ravenous and doomed and mute as gorgons shambling the brutal wastes of Gondwanaland in a time before nomenclature was and each was all. They killed wild meat, and they took what they required by way of commissary from the pueblos and estancias through which they passed. One evening, almost within sight of the town of El Paso, they looked off toward the north where the Galinos wintered, and they knew they would not be going there. They camped that night at the Hueco tanks, a group of natural stone cisterns in the desert. The rocks about in every sheltered place were covered with ancient paintings, and the judge was soon among them copying out those certain ones into his book to take away with him. They were of men and animals, and of the chase, and there were curious birds and arcane maps, and there were constructions of such singular vision as to justify every fear of man and the things that are in him. Of these etchings, some bright yet with color, there were hundreds, and yet the judge went among them with assurance, tracing out the very ones which he required. When he had done, and while there yet was light, he returned to a certain stone ledge and sat a while and studied again the work there. Then he rose, and with a piece of broken shirt he scalped away one of the designs, leaving no trace of it, only a raw place on the stone where it had been. Then he put up his book and returned to the camp. In the morning they rode out to the south. Little was said, nor were they quarrelsome among themselves. In 3 days they would fall upon a band of peaceful Tiguas camped on the river and slaughter them every soul. On the eve of that day they crouched about the fire where it hissed in a softly falling rain, and they ran balls and cut patches as if the fate of the aborigines had been cast into shape by some other agency altogether. As if such destinies were prefigured in the very rock for those with eyes to read. No man stood to tender them a defense. Toadvine and the kid conferred together, and when they rode out at noon the day following, they trotted their horses alongside Bathcat. They rode in silence. "Them sons of bitches ain't bothering nobody," Toadvine said. The Vandymanlander looked at him. He looked at the livid letters tattooed on his forehead, and at the lank greasy hair that hung from his earless skull. He looked at the necklace of gold teeth at his chest. They rode on. They approached those wretched pavilions in the long light of the day's failing, coming up from downwind along the south bank of the river where they could smell the wood smoke of the cook fires. When the first dogs barked, Glanton roweled his horse forward, and they came out of the trees and across the dry scrub with the long necks of the horses leaning out of the dust, avid as hounds, and the riders squirting them on into the sun, where the shapes of the women rising up from their tasks stood flat and rigid in silhouette for a moment before they could quite believe in the reality of that dusty pandemoniac pounding down upon them. They stood dumb, barefoot, clad in the unbleached cotton of the country. They clutched cooking ladles, naked children. At the first fire 12 of them crumpled and fell. The others had begun to run, old people flinging up their hands, children tottering and blinking in the pistol fire. A few young men ran out with drawn bows and were shot down, and then the riders were all through the village, trampling down the grass wickiups and bludgeoning the shrieking householders. Long past dark that night, when the moon was already up, a party of women that had been up river drying fish returned to the village and wandered howling through the ruins. A few fires still smoldered on the ground, and dogs slank off from among the corpses. An old woman knelt at the blackened stones before her door, and poked brush into the coals and blew back a flame from the ashes and began to right the overturned pots. All about her the dead lay with their peeled skulls like polyps bluely wet or luminescent melons cooling on some mesa of the moon. In the days to come, the frail black rebusses of blood in those sands would crack and break and drift away, so that in the circuit of few suns, all trace of the destruction of these people would be erased. The desert wind would salt their ruins, and there would be nothing, nor ghost nor scribe, to tell to any pilgrim in his passing how it was that people had lived in this place, and in this place died. The Americans entered the town of Cariza late in the afternoon of the second day following, their horses festooned with the reeking scalps of the Tiguas. This town had fallen almost to ruin. Many of the houses stood empty, and the Presidio was collapsing back into the earth, out of which it had been raised, and the inhabitants seemed themselves made vacant by old terrors. They watched the passing of that blood-stained argosy through their streets with dark and solemn eyes. Those riders seemed journeyed from a legendary world, and they left behind a strange tincture like an afterimage on the eye, and the air they disturbed was altered and electric. They passed along the ruinous walls of the cemetery, where the dead were trestled up in niches and the ground strewn with bones and skulls and broken pots like some more ancient ossuary. Other ragged folk appeared in the dusty streets behind them and stood looking after. That night they camped at a warm spring atop a hill, amid old traces of Spanish masonry, and they stripped and descended like acolytes into the water, while huge white leeches willowed away over the sands. When they rode out in the morning, it was still dark. Lightning stood in ragged chains far to the south, silent, the staccato mountains bespoke in blue and barren out of the void. Day broke upon a smoking reach of desert darkly clouded, where the riders could count 5 separate storms spaced upon the shores of the round earth. They were riding in pure sand, and the horses labored so hugely that the men were obliged to dismount and lead them, toiling up steep eskers, where the wind blew the white pumice from the crests like the spume from sea swells, and the sand was scalloped and frailly shaped, and nothing else was there save random polished bones. They were all day among the dunes, and in the evening coming down from the last low sandhills to the plain below among catclaw and crucifixion thorn. They were a parched and haggard lot, man and beast. Harpy eagles flew up screaming from a dead mule and wheeled off westward into the sun as they led the horses out onto the plain. 2 nights later, bivouacked in a pass in the mountains, they could see the distant lights of the city below them. They crouched along a shale ridge in the leeward wall of the gap, while the fire sawed in the wind, and they watched the lamps winking in the blue floor of the night 30 miles away. The judge crossed before them in the dark. Sparks from the fire ran down the wind. He took his seat among the scrabbled plates of shale out there, and so they sat like beings from an older age watching the distant lamps dim out one by one, until the city on the plain had shrunk to a small core of light that might have been a burning tree or some solitary encampment of travelers, or perhaps no ponderable fire at all. As they rode out through the tall wooden gates of the governor's palace, 2 soldiers, who had been standing there counting them, passed, stepped forward, and took Toadvine's horse by the headstall. Glanton passed him on the right and rode on. Toadvine stood in the saddle. "Glanton!" The riders clattered into the street. Glanton, just beyond the gates, looked back. The soldiers were speaking to Toadvine in Spanish, and one held an escopeta on him. "I ain't got nobody's teeth," Glanton said. "I'll shoot these 2 fools where they stand." Glanton spat. He looked down the street and he looked at Toadvine. Then he dismounted and led his horse back into the courtyard. "Vamonos," he said. He looked up at Toadvine. "Get off your horse." They rode out of town under escort 2 days later, upward of 100 soldiers herding them along the road, uneasy in their varied dress and arms, wrenching their horses about and booting them through the ford, where the American horses had stopped to drink. In the foothills above the aqueduct, they reined to one side, and the Americans filed past and wound up through the rocks and nopal, and diminished among the shadows and were gone. They rode west into the mountains. They passed through small villages, doffing their hats to folk whom they would murder before the month was out, mud pueblos that lay like plague towns with the crops rotting in the fields, and what stock not driven off by the Indians wandering at will, and none to herd or tend it, and many villages almost wholly depopulated of male inhabitants, where the women and children crouched in terror in their hovels, listening until the last hoofclop died in the distance. At the town of Nakori, there was a cantina, and here the company dismounted and crowded through the doorway and took tables. Tobin volunteered to guard the horses. He stood watching up and down the street. No one paid him any mind. These people had seen Americans in plenty dusty, laggard trains of them months out of their own country, and half crazed with the enormity of their own presence in that immense and blood-slaked waste, commandeering meal and meat, or indulging a latent taste for rape among the slow-eyed girls of that country. Now it was something near to an hour past noon, and a number of workers and tradesmen were crossing the street toward the cantina. As they passed Glanton's horse, Glanton's dog rose up bristling. They veered slightly and went on. At the same moment, a deputation of dogs of the village had started across the plaza, 5, 6 of them, their eyes on Glanton's dog. As they did so, a juggler leading a funeral rounded the corner into the street, and taking a rocket from among several under his arm, he held it to the cigarillo in his mouth and tossed it into the plaza, where it exploded. The pack of dogs shied and scrambled back, save for 2 who continued into the street. Among the Mexican horses tethered at the bar before the cantina, several shot out a hind leg, and the rest stepped about nervously. Glanton's dog did not take his eyes from the men moving toward the door. None of the American horses even raised an ear. The pair of dogs that had crossed in front of the funeral procession veered off from the kicking horses and came on toward the cantina. 2 more rockets exploded in the street, and now the rest of the procession had swung into view, a fiddler and a cornet player leading with a quick and lively tune. The dogs were trapped between the funeral and the animals of the mercenaries, and they halted and flattened their ears and began to sidle and trot. Finally, they bolted across the street behind the pallbearers. These details should have stood the workers entering the cantina in better stead. They had turned, and they stood now with their backs to the door, holding their hats to their chests. The pallbearers passed, carrying on their shoulders a bier, and the watchers could see in her burial dress among the flowers the gray-looking face of a young woman jostling along woodenly. Behind came her coffin, made from rawhide blacked with lampblack, carried by dark-clad porters and looking much like a rude hide boat. At the rear advanced a company of mourners, some of the men drinking. The old women in their dusty black shawls helped weeping over the potholes, and children bearing flowers who looked shyly at the spectators in the street as they passed. Within the cantina, the Americans had no more than seated themselves before a muttered insult from a nearby table brought 3 or 4 of them to their feet. The kid addressed the table in his wretched Spanish and demanded which among those sullen inebriates had spoken. Before any could own it, the first of the funeral rockets exploded in the street as told, and the entire company of Americans made for the door. A drunk at the table rose to his feet with a knife and lurched after them. His friends called after him, but he waved them away. John Dorsey and Henderson Smith, 2 boys from Missouri, were the first into the street. They were followed by Charlie Brown and the judge. The judge could see over their heads, and he raised one hand to those behind him. The beer was just passing. The fiddler and the cornetist were making little bows to each other, and their steps suggested the martial style of the air they played. "It's a funeral," said the judge. As he spoke, the drunk with the knife, now reeling in the doorway, sank the blade deep into the back of a man named Grimley. None saw it but the judge. Grimley put a hand on the rough wood frame of the door. "I'm killed," he said. The judge drew his belt pistol and leveled it above the heads of the men and shot the drunk through the middle of the forehead. The Americans outside the door were all but looking down the barrel of the judge's pistol when he fired, and most of them dove to the ground. Dorsey rolled clear and got to his feet and collided with the workers who'd been paying their respects to the passing cortege. They were putting their hats on when the judge fired. The dead man fell backward into the cantina, blood spouting from his head. When Grimley turned, they could see the wooden handle of the knife protruding from his bloody shirt. Other knives were already in play. Dorsey was grappling with the Mexicans, and Henderson Smith had drawn his bowie and half-severed a man's arm with it, and the man was standing with the dark arterial blood spraying between his fingers where he tried to hold the wound shut. The judge got Dorsey to his feet, and they backed toward the cantina with the Mexicans fainting and jabbing at them with their knives. From inside came the uninterrupted sound of gunfire, and the door frame was filling up with smoke. The judge turned at the door and stepped over the several corpses sprawled there. Inside, the huge pistols roared without intermission, and the 20 or so Mexicans who'd been in the room were strewn about in every position, shot to pieces among the overturned chairs, and the tables with the fresh splinters blown out of the wood and the mud walls pocked everywhere by the big conical bullets. The survivors were making for the daylight in the doorway, and the first of these encountered the judge there and cut at him with his knife. But the judge was like a cat, and he sidestepped the man and seized his arm and broke it and picked the man up by his head. He put him against the wall and smiled at him. But the man had begun to bleed from the ears, and the blood was running down between the judge's fingers and over his hands, and when the judge turned him loose, there was something wrong with his head, and he slid to the floor and did not get up. Those behind him had meanwhile met with a great battery of gunfire, and the doorway was jammed with the dead and dying when there was suddenly a great ringing silence in the room. The judge stood with his back to the wall. The smoke drifted through like fog, and the shrouded figures stood frozen. In the center of the room, Toadvine and the kid were standing back to back with their pistols at port like duelists. The judge stepped to the door and shouted across the stacked bodies to the ex-priest where he stood among the horses with his pistol drawn. The laggards, priest, the laggards. They'd not have shot men in public in a town so large, but there was no help for it. 3 men were running down the street, and 2 others were legging it across the square. Of other souls abroad there were none. Tobin stepped from between the horses and leveled the big pistol in both hands and began to fire, the pistol bucking and dropping back, and the runners wobbling and pitching headlong. He shot the two in the plaza and swung and shot down the runners in the street. The last one fell in a doorway, and Tobin turned and drew the other pistol from his belt and stepped to the other side of the horse and looked up the street and across the square for any sign of movement there or among the buildings. The judge stepped back from the doorway into the cantina where the Americans stood looking at each other and at the bodies in a sort of wonder. They looked at Glanton. His eyes cut across the smoking room, his hat lying on a table. He stepped over and got it and set it on his head and squared it. He looked about. The men were reloading the empty chambers in their pistols. "Here, boys," he said. "The string ain't run on this trade yet." When they left the cantina, 10 minutes later the streets were deserted. They had scalped the entire body of the dead, sliding about on a floor that had been packed clay and was now a wine-colored mud. There were 28 Mexicans inside the tavern and 8 more in the street, including the 5 the ex-priest had shot. They mounted up. Grimly sat slumped sideways against the mud wall of the building. He did not look up. He was holding his pistol in his lap and looking off down the street, and they turned and rode out along the north side of the plaza and disappeared. It was 30 minutes before anyone appeared in the street. They spoke in whispers. As they approached the cantina, one of the men from inside appeared in the doorway like a bloody apparition. He had been scalped, and the blood was all run down into his eyes, and he was holding shut a huge hole in his chest, where a pink froth breathed in and out. One of the citizens laid a hand on his shoulder. "A donde vas?" he said. "A casa," said the man. The next town they entered was 2 days deeper into the Sierras. They never knew what it was called. A collection of mud huts pitched on the naked plateau. As they rode in, the people ran before them like harried game. Their cries to one another, or perhaps the visible frailty of them, seemed to incite something in Glanton. Brown watched him. He nudged forth his horse and drew his pistol, and this somnolent pueblo was forthwith dragooned into a weltering shambles. Many of the people had been running toward the church where they knelt clutching the altar, and from this refuge they were dragged howling, one by one, and one by one they were slain and scalped in the chancel floor. When the riders passed through this same village 4 days later, the dead were still in the streets, and buzzards and pigs were feeding on them. The scavengers watched in silence while the company picked their way past like supernumeraries in a dream. When the last of them was gone, they commenced to feed again. They went on through the mountains without resting. They trod a narrow trail through a black pine wood by day, and by dark and in silence, save for the creaking of tack and the breathing of the horses. A thin shell of a moon lay capsized over the jagged peaks. They rode down into a mountain town just before day, where there was no lamp nor watchman nor dog. In the gray dawn, they sat along a wall waiting for daylight. A rooster called. A door slammed. An old woman came down the lane past the daub-sty walls through the mist carrying a yoke of jars. They rose up. It was cold and their breath plumed about them. They took down the poles in the corral and led the horses out. They rode up the street. They halted. The animals sidled and stamped in the cold. Glanton had reined up and drawn his pistol. A company of mounted troops passed out from behind a wall at the north end of the village and turned into the street. They wore tall shakos faced with metal plates and horsehair plumes, and they wore green coats trimmed with scarlet and scarlet sashes, and they were armed with lances and muskets, and their mounts were nicely caparisoned. And they entered the street sidling and prancing, horsemen riding upon horses, all of them desirable young men. The company looked to Glanton. He holstered the pistol and drew his rifle. The captain of the Lancers had raised his saber to halt the column. The next instant the narrow street was filled with rifle smoke, and a dozen of the soldiers lay dead or dying on the ground. The horses reared and screamed and fell back upon each other, and men were unhorsed and rose up struggling to hold their mounts. A second fire tore through their ranks. They fell away in confusion. The Americans drew their pistols and booted their horses forward up the street. The Mexican captain was bleeding from a gunshot wound in the chest, and he stood in the stirrups to receive the charge with his saber. Glanton shot him through the head and shoved him from his horse with his foot, and shot down in succession 3 men behind him. A soldier on the ground had picked up a lance and ran at him with it, and one of the riders leaned down out of that wild melee and cut his throat and passed on. In the morning dampness, the sulphurous smoke hung over the street in a gray shroud. and the colorful lancers fell under the horses in that perilous mist like soldiers slaughtered in a dream, wide-eyed and wooden and mute. Some among the rear guard had managed to turn their mounts and start back up the street, and the Americans were clouting back with pistol barrels the riderless horses, and the horses surged and milled with the stirrups kicking out, and they trumpeted with their long mouths and trampled underfoot the dead. They beat them back and urged their horses through and up the street to where it narrowed and turned up the mountain, and they fired after the fleeing lancers as they skeltered up the trail in a rattle of small stones. Glanton sent a detachment of 5 men to follow, and he and the judge and Bathcat turned back. They met the rest of the company riding up, and they turned back, and they went down and looted the bodies where they lay in the street like dead bandsmen, and they smashed their muskets against the walls of the houses and broke their swords and lances. As they rode out, they met the 5 scouts returning. The lancers had quit the trail and scattered through the woods. 2 nights later, camped on a butte looking out over the broad central plain, they could see a point of light out on that desert, like the reflection of a single star in a lake of utter blackness. They took counsel. On that raw tablestone, the flames of their balefire swirled and circled, and they studied the errant blackness under them, where it fell away like the sheer cloven face of the world. "How far do you make them?" said Glanton. Holden shook his head. "They've made half a day on us. They number no more than 12, 14. They won't send men ahead." "How far are we from Chihuahua City?" 4 days. 3. Where's Davy?" Glanton turned. "How far to Chihuahua, David?" Brown stood with his back to the fire. He nodded. "If that's them, they could be there in 3 days. You reckon we can overhaul them? I don't know. Might depend on whether they figure us to be after them." Glanton turned and spat into the fire. The judge raised one pale and naked arm and pursued something in the pit of it with his fingers. "If we can be off of this mountain by daylight," he said, "I believe we can overtake them. Otherwise, we had better make for Sonora. They may be from Sonora. Then we'd better go get them. We could take these scalps to Ures." The fire swept along the ground. It rose again. "We'd better go get them," said the judge. They rode onto the plain at dawn, as the judge had said, and that night they could see the fire of the Mexicans reflected in the sky to the east beyond the curve of the earth. All the day following they rode, and all that night, jerking and lurching like a deputation of spastics as they slept in their saddles. On the morning of the 3rd day, they could see the riders before them on the plain in silhouette against the sun, and in the evening they could count their number struggling upon that desolate mineral waste. When the sun rose, the walls of the city stood pale and thin in the rising light 20 miles to the east. They sat their horses. The lancers were strung out along the road several miles to the south of them. There was no reason for them to stop, and no hope in it any more than there was in the riding, but as they were riding they rode, and the Americans put their horses forward once again. For a while they rode almost parallel toward the gates of the city, the 2 parties bloody and ragged, the horses stumbling. Glanton called out to them to surrender, but they rode on. He drew his rifle. They were shambling along the road like dumb things. He pulled up his horse, and it stood with its legs spread and its flanks heaving, and he leveled the rifle and fired. They were, for the most part, no longer even armed. There were 9 of them, and they halted and turned, and then they charged across that intermittent ground of rock and scrub, and were shot down in the space of a minute. The horses were caught and herded back to the road, and the saddles and trappings cut away. The bodies of the dead were stripped, and their uniforms and weapons burned along with the saddles and other gear, and the Americans dug a pit in the road and buried them in a common grave, the naked bodies with their wounds, like the victims of surgical experimentation lying in the pit, gaping sightlessly at the desert sky as the dirt was pushed over them. They trampled the spot with their horses until it looked much like the road again, and the smoking gunlocks and saber blades and girth rings were dragged from the ashes of the fire and carried away and buried in a separate place, and the riderless horses hazed off into the desert, and in the evening the wind carried away the ashes, and the wind blew in the night, and fanned the last smoldering billets, and drove forth the last fragile race of sparks fugitive as flint strikings in the unanimous dark of the world. They entered the city haggard and filthy and reeking with the blood of the citizenry for whose protection they had contracted. The scalps of the slain villagers were strung from the windows of the governor's house, and the partisans were paid out of the all but exhausted coffers, and the Sociedad was disbanded and the bounty rescinded. Within a week of their quitting the city, there would be a price of 8,000 pesos posted for Glanton's head. They rode out on the North Road, as would parties bound for El Paso, but before they were even quite out of sight of the city, they had turned their tragic mounts to the west, and they rode infatuate and half-fawn toward the red demise of that day, toward the evening lands and the distant pandemonium of the